back from the brink, as in a sense. Let me bring in Professor Swaran Singh. President Putin says that he will not break the non-proliferation agreements. So the Russian commentators are talking about a possible nuclear strike. Now, what's the position? They say that they have these nuclear weapons in place, but they are not going to be used on the battlefield. Is that realistic? I mean, is that some way of looking at things? How do you see it, Professor Swaran Singh?
Thank you, Mark, for having me on your program. Nuclear weapons are always understood as primarily political weapons rather than military weapons, which means the real use of nuclear weapons lies in their non-use.
Okay.
And therefore, it is meant for deterrence rather than actually war fighting. But to make deterrence convincing, countries have to also prepare for war fighting as to if push comes to shove, how will they be actually using these weapons? And when we talk of using these weapons, the most the practical part of that thinking has been to use tactical nuclear weapons and not the really more dangerous strategic weapons. And in that sense, the movement of tactical nuclear weapons becomes very, very sort of unnerving in that sense.
Yes.
Now, the fundamental question here is: does this deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus mean a violation of NPT? Multiple interpretations. For example, the United States has deployed tactical nuclear weapons in 5 of its allies in Europe itself: Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Turkey. Now, explanation US gives is to say these were deployments that preceded the very making of a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and second, that the control of these weapons remains in the hands of United States.
Right.
Only when actual use has to happen, then maybe that command could be transferred. And it is the same thing that President Putin is saying, that in case, as he's planning, in fact, dates are really dangerous, that he wants to train Belarus pilots from next month, deploy tactical nuclear weapons by 1st of July. But, if you look at the track record of Russia, they have been trying for 7 years to deploy nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad, for example. So part of it definitely part of it is rhetoric, but it can't be ruled out. And he's simply saying, I want to do same thing as United States has done, deploy these weapons, but not really give the actual operational control. But 2-3 things very quickly in 10 to 15 seconds. It fundamentally means, upsetting the whole arms control architecture. It also, secondly, means disrupting the whole command structure of Russian nuclear forces. And, it's also in some sense dangerous because it is going to be destabilizing. Already the Madrid summit of NATO last year had said they want to fortify their eastern flank as the NATO expands eastwards. That is what is disrupting the whole thinking in Moscow. So in multiple ways, this could be disrupting even as rhetoric.
It is brinkmanship that has led to the war. It just went on going on. People were not taking the Russians seriously enough, and then they did invade last year. Professor Swaran Singh, Biden said on Canadian soil, in fact, he said that China has not supplied weapons to Russia. So does actually Russia have Chinese support? Bringing in the Chinese angle is important because Russia has said that it's willing to follow the Chinese peace plan.
Indeed, Mark, if you look at the joint declaration that came from the early this week, last week now, meeting of President Xi Jinping and Putin in Moscow, among several other things, they underlined the fact that they would like nations to behave in the sense that they should not deploy nuclear weapons in foreign soil. And if they have deployed nuclear weapons on foreign soil, they should be actually withdrawing those. And this was a clear sort of allusion or indication towards American forces and nuclear forces being deployed, about 200 weapons being deployed in 5 countries in Europe. And I think that was an endorsement from China of what President Putin has been saying. Indeed, even this whole hype about Belarus is nothing new. Even last year, the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, in June last year also had asked that since the US was beginning to train Polish pilots for potentially, sort of deploying aircrafts with nuclear weapons, he had requested Putin, even at that time, June last year, saying that this is time that Russia should be beginning to think of deploying weapons in Belarus. So yes, Russia has really valued China's support, and it has really been the constant refrain of American agencies saying that even today they believe that Beijing is still considering to supply weapons to Russia. In fact, they have gone to the extent of saying that they have already confirmed use of Chinese ammunitions by Russian forces. Now,
Okay.
how reliable are these? We don't know as of now, but
So
definitely
that's
China's
serious.
support, most important support to President Putin.
Okay. Swan Singh, final word from you. What about a U.S.-China summit? Is it likely to de-escalate tensions? As I said earlier, Russia has already pointed to the Chinese peace plan, and in fact, the EU leaders were saying that if we have to see any peace, it has to be something that the U.S. and China will have to agree upon.
Lip service.
Okay.
Such summit meetings between President Xi and Biden are, expected to bring down tempers slightly. But I want to do underline the fact that you asked about North Korea's nuclear
Yes.
weapons and the link with China. I think you have to understand President Yoon of South Korea, like Belarus, is asking United States to also deploy nuclear weapons on their territory in that sense because of threat of North Korea. And it makes it very, interesting that China has important links with Pakistan, with North Korea, with Russia,
Yes.
and Russia's increasing military cooperation with Pakistan and China. I think India has to also wake up and take note of some of these developments. As Prime Minister is visiting US in June, I think some of these issues will come up there. And definitely, if US and China have a summit meeting, I think that will clarify some of these anxieties, which are not only coming up in European nations because of Belarus potentially asking for deployments of nuclear weapons, but also countries like India. I think have to be careful as to how these dynamics come about, how they sort of play upon China becoming far more influential. And in that sense, I think it would be an issue for Indian Prime Minister's conversation with President Biden in Washington in June.
Okay.